Hey everyone, tonight we journey into the quiet resilience of Chinese peasants across the centuries, exploring their remarkable survival strategies through brutal winters, ingenious solutions, and the gentle rhythms of daily life that sustained entire civilizations. From the frozen fields of northern China to the quiet wisdom of rural communities, their story is one of endurance, adaptation, and the simple beauty of making do with what you have. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I share here. And let me know in the comments where you're at tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always wonderful to see our global community coming together for these peaceful journeys through history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on that gentle fan for some soft background sound, and let's drift together into tonight's exploration of survival, ingenuity, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. When you imagine ancient China, you might picture the great walls stretching endlessly across mountain ridges, or the Forbidden City with its golden roofs gleaming in the sun, or perhaps the Silk Road traders with their caravans of exotic goods. But for the vast majority of Chinese people, throughout history, life looked very different. It was the life of the peasant, the farmer, the villager who worked the same plot of land their ancestors had tended for generations. These were people who faced winter, not with grand palaces or armies to protect them, but with nothing more than their wits, their neighbours, and whatever scraps of warmth they could gather from a world that seemed determined to freeze them solid. Picture this. You're living in a small village in northern China during the Tang dynasty, maybe around the 8th century. Your house isn't the stuff of legends. It's made of compressed earth, maybe some wood if you're lucky, with walls so thin that you can hear your neighbour's chickens arguing with each other next door. There's no central heating, no electric blankets, no thermostat wars with your siblings. The temperature inside your home was whatever the outside world decided it should be, plus maybe a degree or two if you were sitting directly next to the fire. If it was -10 outside, congratulations. Your home was now a brisk -8 degrees. Luxury living, Tang dynasty style. The nights were the true test. When the sun disappeared behind the mountains and darkness settled over the village like a heavy blanket, the cold would creep in through every crack, every gap in the walls, every loose board in the door. The wind would howl across the plains, carrying with it the bite of Siberian winters, and inside their tiny homes, families would huddle together, counting their breaths and hoping morning would come before the cold claimed another victim. This wasn't just discomfort. This was a nightly battle for survival, fought with nothing but human ingenuity and the stubborn refusal to give in to the ice. But here's the remarkable thing about Chinese peasants throughout history. They didn't just survive these brutal conditions, they developed an entire culture around winter survival. They created systems, traditions, and techniques that were passed down from parent to child for thousands of years. They learned to read the sky like a book, to predict weather patterns months in advance, to store food and fuel with mathematical precision. They discovered ways to generate heat, conserve energy, and maintain their health that modern science is only now beginning to understand and appreciate. Their homes might have been humble, but their knowledge was vast. They understood that survival wasn't about having the most resources, it was about using every resource perfectly. They knew which herbs would warm the body from within, how to position their sleeping areas to capture and hold the tiniest bit of heat, and how to work together as a community to ensure that even the weakest among them made it through to spring. Winter in rural China wasn't just a season, it was a semester in the University of Life, and these peasants had graduated with honours every single year. They had to because failure meant death, and success meant the chance to plant crops again when the earth finally thawed. So as we settle in tonight, let's explore how these ingenious, resourceful people turned survival into an art form, one cold night at a time. Chinese peasant homes weren't built for comfort, they were built for survival. And if you think your apartment has problems because the window doesn't seal properly, medieval Chinese peasants would like to have a word. Their homes were basically very optimistic attempts at keeping the outdoors from becoming the indoors, and sometimes that optimism was misplaced. Most peasant houses were constructed using whatever materials the local environment provided. In northern China, where winters could be absolutely merciless, this often meant rammed earth walls, thick and solid, built by packing damp soil into wooden frames and letting it dry into something resembling concrete. These walls were actually quite effective at insulation when built properly, but proper construction required time, money, and materials that many families simply didn't have. So you ended up with walls that were thick in some places, thin in others, and occasionally featuring surprise ventilation holes that nobody had planned for. The roofs were another adventure entirely. Wealthy peasants might have real tiles clay-fired and fitted together like a protective shell, but most families made do with thatch, straw, or whatever organic materials they could gather. These roofs were cheap, renewable, and surprisingly good at keeping out rain and snow when they weren't busy letting in the local wildlife. Nothing quite says good morning, like a sparrow dropping onto your breakfast porridge, or discovering that a family of mice has been using your roof as their personal highway system. Windows, when they existed at all, were small openings covered with paper, oiled cloth, or thin sheets of animal hide. Glass was a luxury that most peasants could only dream about. These window coverings kept out the worst of the wind, but they also kept out most of the light. So winter days indoors were dark, dim affairs that felt more like living inside a cave than a house. On the bright side, if you accidentally tore a hole in your paper window, you could always patch it with more paper and consider it rustic interior decorating. Floors were typically packed earth, sometimes covered with woven mats if the family was doing well, or maybe some straw if they were feeling fancy. In winter, these floors became radiators of cold, sucking the warmth right out of your feet and sending it deep into the earth, where it would presumably keep the earthworms comfortable. Walking barefoot on these floors in winter was like stepping onto a block of ice that had been left in a freezer for a week. Doors were wooden when they were wooden, and hung on leather hinges that had a tendency to shrink and crack in the cold. This meant that doors rarely fit their frames perfectly, leaving gaps that invited the winter wind to come inside and make itself at home. Some families stuffed these gaps with rags, straw, or anything else they could find, creating doors that looked like they'd been attacked by a very determined pack rat. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of these homes was their size. Peasant houses were small, usually consisting of just 1 or 2 rooms where an entire extended family would live, work, cook, and sleep. Privacy was a concept that hadn't been invented yet, or maybe it had been invented, but peasants couldn't afford it. When winter came, this lack of space actually became an advantage, as multiple bodies in a small area generated more heat than one person in a large room. It was like human central heating, just with more elbows in your ribs and significantly more snoring. These homes weren't architectural marvels. They weren't featured in our ancient Chinese home and garden magazines, and they certainly weren't comfortable by modern standards, but they were shelters. And for the peasants who built them, improved them, and huddled inside them during the long winter months, they were the difference between life and death. And sometimes, when the wind was howling outside and the family was warm inside, even a humble earth-walled house could feel like the finest palace in all of China. If there was one thing Chinese peasants understood better than anyone else, it was the art of the communal sleeping arrangement. When the temperature drops to levels that could freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth, individual sleeping spaces become a luxury that only the dead can afford. So peasant families developed what we might call strategic cuddling. And if that sounds undignified, well, dignity was another luxury they couldn't afford in January. Entire families would pile together on a single sleeping surface, usually a large platform called a kang in northern China. The kang wasn't just a bed, it was a heated platform, a piece of furniture that doubled as the family heating system. Built from brick and clay, it was positioned directly over the house's fire system, so warm air and smoke from the cooking fire would travel through channels beneath the sleeping surface before exiting through the chimney. It was like sleeping on top of a very flat, very wide radiator that also happened to be your kitchen stove. But even with a heated kang, the sleeping arrangements were carefully orchestrated for maximum warmth retention. Grandparents, being the most vulnerable to cold, were placed in the centre where they'd be surrounded by the body heat of the younger generation. Parents formed the next layer, and children were tucked in wherever there was space, usually wedged between adults, like small fidgety hot water bottles. If you were unlucky enough to end up on the edge of the sleeping area, congratulations, you are now the family's designated cold weather buffer zone. Blankets and covers were shared, and this wasn't about generosity, it was about survival. A family might have 1 or 2 thick quilts stuffed with cotton, or, if they were lucky, down from ducks or geese. These quilts would be spread over the entire group, creating a communal cocoon that trapped everyone's body, heat moving too much during the night. Wasn't just inconsiderate, it was potentially dangerous, as it could let cold air into the carefully maintained warm zone under the covers. Sleeping in shifts was another common strategy. Someone had to tend the fire throughout the night, adding fuel and making sure the flames didn't die out. Completely, family members would take turns getting up to poke the fire, add wood or dried grass, and generally keep the heat flowing through the kang system. This meant that there was always someone awake, always someone moving around, and always someone grumbling about having to leave the warm pile to deal with the fire at 3 a.m. Children learned early that nighttime movement was a group decision. If you needed to get up for any reason, you had to do it carefully, quickly, and with minimal disruption to the family heat bubble. There were no individual bathroom breaks, no wandering around in the middle of the night, no getting up for a glass of water. If you were thirsty, you waited until morning. If you were uncomfortable, you learned to be uncomfortable quietly. And then there were the guests. In Chinese culture, hospitality was sacred, and turning away a traveller on a cold night was unthinkable. But adding an extra body to an already crowded sleeping arrangement required serious logistical planning. Families would somehow make room, squeezing together even more tightly, sharing their warmth with strangers who might bring news from the outside world, but who also brought cold air and took up precious space in the communal bed. The morning ritual was its own careful dance. The first person to wake up, usually whoever was responsible for starting the day's cooking fire, would slip out as quietly as possible, quickly stoking the flames to warm the house before everyone else had to get up. Gradually, one by one, family members would emerge from the warm cocoon, moving quickly to dress and start their daily tasks before the cold could fully penetrate their sleep-warmed bodies. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't private, and it definitely wasn't quiet. But it worked. Families survived bitter winters huddled together, sharing their warmth, their covers, and their lives in the most intimate way possible. And in the process, they created bonds that went far beyond mere survival. They learned to sleep as a community, to share space without conflict, and to find comfort in the breathing, shifting, quietly snoring presence of the people they loved most in the world. Chinese peasants didn't have furnaces or central heating, but they did have fire, and they treated fire with the reverence usually reserved for gods because, in many ways, fire was their god. It was the deity that stood between them and death, the flickering orange guardian that required constant attention, regular offerings, and absolute respect. Letting the fire die wasn't just inconvenient, it was a betrayal of the most sacred trust between humans and the forces that kept them alive. The hearth was the centre of peasant life, literally and figuratively. It was positioned in the main room of the house, and everything else, the sleeping areas, the storage spaces, the work areas, was arranged around it like worshippers around an altar. The fire provided heat, light, and the means to cook food, but more than that, it provided hope. As long as the flames danced, life was possible. When they died out, survival became a much more desperate proposition. Keeping a fire burning all night required fuel, and fuel was precious. Wood was ideal, but many peasant families couldn't afford to burn wood constantly. Instead, they used whatever they could find. Dried grass, animal dung, corn cobs, rice husks, even old clothing that had become too tattered to wear. Each type of fuel burned differently, and experienced fire tenders learned to read their flames, like a book, knowing exactly when to add what material to keep the heat steady and the smoke manageable. Dried animal dung was particularly valuable because it burned slowly and evenly, providing steady heat for hours. Families would collect it throughout the year, drying it in the sun and storing it in carefully protected piles. To outsiders, a peasant family's dung pile might have looked like waste, but to the family, it represented survival, warmth, and the difference between a bearable winter and a fatal one. The technique of banking fires was elevated to an art form. Before going to sleep, the family fire tender would carefully arrange the burning coals and embers, covering them with a layer of ash to slow the burning process. This ash blanket acted like a thermostat, allowing the coals to smoulder quietly throughout the night without going out completely. If done correctly, a banked fire could stay alive for 8 or 10 hours, ready to be coaxed back to full flame with a bit of kindling and some gentle blowing. But banking a fire was risky business. Cover the embers too much and they'd go out completely. Leave them too exposed and they'd burn too quickly, consuming fuel and dying out before morning. It required experience, intuition, and a bit of luck. Families developed their own techniques, their own little secrets passed down through generations. Some swore by specific types of ash, others had theories about coal arrangement, and most had backup plans for the dreaded morning discovery that the fire had died during the night. Restarting a dead fire in the middle of winter was a nightmare scenario. Without matches or lighters, this meant using flint and steel or fire bows, or trying to borrow coals from a neighbour if you were lucky enough to have neighbours close by. In rural areas where houses might be separated by significant distances, a dead fire could mean death, especially for elderly family members or young children who couldn't generate enough body heat to survive the cold. That's why fire tending was such a serious responsibility. Family members took turns staying up to check on the flames, adding fuel as needed, adjusting the airflow, making sure their lifeline stayed strong throughout the long winter nights. It was exhausting work, but it was also meditative, hypnotic even. There's something deeply calming about watching flames dance, listening to the soft crackle of burning wood, feeling the warm glow on your face while the cold world lurks just beyond the fire's reach. Children learned fire tending skills early, starting with simple tasks like gathering kindling and gradually working up to the more complex responsibilities of fuel management and fire banking. It was essential education because a child who couldn't maintain a fire was a child who might not survive to adulthood. The fire was more than just a heating system, it was the heartbeat of the household. Families gathered around it to cook, to work on crafts, to tell stories, to simply exist together in the warm circle of light it provided. In a world where entertainment was scarce and nights were long, the fire was theatre, television, and social centre all rolled into one flickering, beautiful, absolutely essential package. When morning came and the fire was successfully coaxed back to full flame, it felt like a victory, like beating death for another night. And when spring finally arrived and fires were no longer a matter of life and death, families would look back on their winter fire, tending with a mixture of relief and pride. They had kept the flames alive. They had survived another winter, and they had earned the right to plant crops and hope for another year of life. Chinese peasants understood that surviving winter wasn't just about staying warm, it was about eating enough food to generate internal heat, and this required careful planning that began months before the first frost. Food storage and preservation was elevated to a science, and families who mastered these arts lived, while those who didn't often didn't see spring. The autumn harvest wasn't just about gathering crops, it was about calculating survival. Families had to estimate how much food they would need to last through the winter months, how much they could trade or sell, and how much they needed to save for planting in the spring. Get these calculations wrong, and you might find yourself eating your seed grain in February, which meant no crops the following year and a very hungry future. Rice, when available, was the foundation of winter survival. But not every peasant family could grow rice, and not every region was suitable for rice cultivation. Northern Chinese peasants relied more heavily on wheat, millet, and other grains that could survive colder climates. These grains were dried, threshed, and stored in large ceramic jars or wooden containers, sealed as tightly as possible to keep out moisture, insects, and rodents. Vegetables required different preservation techniques. Cabbage was buried in underground pits, layered with straw, and covered with earth to create natural refrigeration that kept it fresh for months. Turnips, radishes, and other root vegetables were stored in similar underground caches, while leafy greens were dried, pickled, or fermented into preparations that could last through the winter while still providing essential nutrients. Salting and drying were crucial techniques for preserving meat and fish. Families would slaughter animals in late autumn, when the cold weather would help preserve the meat during processing. Every part of the animal was used. Meat was salted and dried, fat was rendered and stored for cooking and lamp fuel, bones were boiled for soup stock, and even organs were preserved in various ways. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant death. Pickling became a high art form, with families developing their own recipes for preserved vegetables that would provide vitamins and flavour during the long winter months. Fermented preparations weren't just about preservation, they were about creating foods that would actually improve nutritionally over time, developing beneficial bacteria that would help maintain health when fresh foods were unavailable. Beans and legumes were dried and stored carefully, providing protein that could sustain families when meat was scarce. Soybeans were particularly valuable because they could be processed into tofu, soy sauce, and other preparations that added variety and nutrition to the winter diet. Families who had mastered bean cultivation and preservation had a significant survival advantage. The daily management of stored food required constant vigilance. Families had to monitor their supplies for signs of spoilage, insect infestation, or rodent damage. They rotated their stock, using older supplies first and constantly checking the condition of their reserves. Running out of food in the middle of winter wasn't just inconvenient, it was often fatal. Cooking techniques were adapted for fuel conservation and maximum nutrition. One-pot meals that could simmer slowly over a low fire made the most of limited fuel while extracting every bit of nutrition from available ingredients. Soups and stews became staples because they could stretch small amounts of vegetables and meat into filling meals that would warm the body from the inside out. Families also had to balance nutrition with calorie density. Winter survival required foods that would provide energy for staying warm, but also the vitamins and minerals needed to maintain health through months of limited fresh food. This meant carefully combining preserved vegetables, grains, and proteins in ways that would meet all nutritional needs while making supplies last as long as possible. The psychological aspect of food storage was just as important as the practical aspects. Knowing that the family had enough food to last through winter provided a sense of security that was essential for maintaining morale during the darkest, coldest months. Families would ritually check their food stores, counting and recounting their supplies, calculating and recalculating how long everything would last. And if stores ran low before spring arrived, families had to make difficult decisions about rationing, about which family members would get how much food, about whether to trade precious belongings for grain, about whether to ask for help from neighbours who might be struggling just as much. These were decisions that no one wanted to make, but that survival sometimes required. Successful food preservation and storage meant the difference between a family that emerged from winter healthy and ready for spring planting, and a family that was weakened, sick, or didn't emerge at all. It was a skill set that required knowledge, planning, hard work, and more than a little luck. But for Chinese peasants, it was absolutely essential for survival. In the biting cold of Chinese winters, clothing wasn't about fashion or status. It was about creating a personal survival system that could keep your body heat from escaping into the frigid air. Chinese peasants developed layering techniques that would make modern outdoor enthusiasts envious, and they did it using whatever materials they could grow, make, or trade for. The base layer was usually a simple tunic made from hemp, or, if the family was prosperous, cotton. This inner garment was worn directly against the skin and was rarely washed during winter months because washing meant getting wet, and getting wet meant potentially fatal exposure to cold. Instead, these inner garments accumulated body oils and grime that actually created an additional insulating layer. It wasn't pleasant, but it was effective. Over the base tunic, peasants would add additional layers of clothing made from hemp, cotton, or wool when available. Each layer trapped air between itself and the layer beneath, creating insulating pockets that helped retain body heat. The key was to avoid compressing these layers too much, because compressed insulation loses its effectiveness. Outer garments were often padded with cotton batting, silk waste, or even paper when other materials weren't available. These padded jackets and pants created thick barriers against the cold, but they were also heavy and bulky. Peasants wearing their full winter outfits looked like walking bundles of cloth, barely recognizable as human beings beneath all the layers. Footwear presented special challenges. Leather boots were expensive and often not available to peasant families. Instead, they wrapped their feet in layers of cloth, stuffed straw or other insulating materials around their feet, and wore wooden clogs or cloth shoes over the wrappings. Some families made boots from layers of cloth soaked in animal fat or oil, which provided some water resistance and helped keep feet warm. Head coverings were crucial because so much body heat is lost through the head and neck. Peasants wore caps made from felt cloth or fur when available, often with ear flaps that could be tied under the chin. Scarves or cloth wraps covered the neck and could be pulled up over the mouth and nose during particularly cold weather. Hands required special protection because frostbitten fingers couldn't do the work necessary for survival. Mittens were preferred over individual finger coverings because they allowed fingers to share warmth. These mittens were often made from scraps of cloth or leather, stuffed with insulating materials and attached to strings that ran through the sleeves, so they couldn't be lost. The challenge with winter clothing was balancing warmth with mobility. Peasants still had to work during winter months, feeding animals, maintaining their homes, gathering fuel, and performing other essential tasks. Clothing that was too bulky made it impossible to work effectively, but clothing that was too thin meant freezing to death. Families developed techniques for quickly adding or removing layers as needed. Working hard generated body heat, so peasants might start the day wearing every layer they owned, then gradually remove layers as their work warmed them up, then quickly add layers again when they stopped working and their bodies began to cool. Clothing repairs were an essential winter skill. Tears, holes, and worn areas had to be patched immediately, because even small openings could let in deadly cold air. Families spent long winter evenings mending and improving their clothing, adding padding where it was needed most, reinforcing areas that received heavy wear, and generally maintaining their personal survival systems. Drying wet clothing was a constant challenge. If clothing got wet from snow, rain, or sweat, it had to be dried quickly before it froze solid. This meant careful management around the fire, holding wet garments close enough to the flames to drive out moisture, but not so close that they scorched or caught fire. Some peasant families had access to silk, which was an excellent insulating material when used in multiple layers. Silk was lightweight, warm, and could be layered effectively without creating too much bulk. However, silk was also valuable for trade, so families had to balance wearing it for warmth against selling it for food or other necessities. The accumulation of body oils, sweat, and grime in winter clothing, while unpleasant, served an important function. These substances helped make the fabric more wind-resistant and added an extra layer of insulation. Spring cleaning wasn't just about hygiene, it was about preparing clothing for the warmer months when heavy insulation was no longer needed. By the end of winter, peasant clothing was often threadbare, patched, and thoroughly worn, but it had served its purpose. Families that successfully maintained their clothing through the winter months had a much better chance of survival, and they emerged into spring with the knowledge and experience to prepare even better for the next winter's challenges. Chinese peasants understood that winter survival was as much about what you put inside your body as what you put on it. Food wasn't just sustenance during the cold months, it was medicine, fuel, and heating system all rolled into one. They developed sophisticated knowledge about which foods would warm the body from within, which would provide sustained energy, and which would maintain health when fresh nutrients were scarce. Hot foods were prioritized during winter months, not just because they felt good to eat, but because the energy required to digest them generated internal heat. Soups, stews, and congees became staples because they could be kept warm over the fire. They stretched limited ingredients into filling meals, and they provided both hydration and nutrition in a form that the body could easily process. Ginger was a winter survival essential, valued not just for its warming properties but for its ability to improve circulation and help the body generate heat more efficiently. Families would add dried ginger to nearly everything during winter months: tea, soup, stews, even simple grain porridge. Fresh ginger, when available, was treasured like gold because of its superior heating properties. Garlic and onions were similarly prized for their warming effects and their ability to help fight off the infections that were common during winter months when families were crowded together in poorly ventilated spaces. These foods were often braided together and hung near the fire where they would stay accessible, and their warming oils would perfume the air. Spices like cinnamon, star anise, and various peppers were used not just for flavour, but for their heating properties. These were expensive and often difficult to obtain, but even small amounts could transform a simple grain porridge into a meal that would warm the body from the inside out. Families would trade precious possessions for small amounts of warming spices. Fermented foods played a crucial role in winter nutrition. Pickled vegetables, fermented bean pastes, and other preserved foods provided probiotics that helped maintain digestive health during months when fresh foods were unavailable. But more than that, these foods were often quite spicy or salty, which helped stimulate circulation and create the sensation of internal warmth. Fatty foods were essential for winter survival because fat provided the most calories per gram and helped the body maintain its internal temperature. Families would save cooking oil, animal fat, and nuts throughout the year, specifically for winter consumption. These high-energy foods were often mixed with grains or vegetables to create warming meals that would sustain energy levels throughout long, cold days. Herbal teas weren't just beverages, they were medicine. Different herbs were believed to have different warming properties, and families would blend their own tea mixtures based on traditional knowledge passed down through generations. These teas provided hydration, warmth, and often medicinal benefits that helped family members stay healthy through the challenging winter months. Alcohol, when available, was used medicinally rather than recreationally. Small amounts of rice wine or other alcoholic beverages were believed to improve circulation and provide internal warming. However, peasant families were careful with alcohol because while it created a temporary sensation of warmth, it actually caused the body to lose heat more quickly. The timing of meals was adjusted for winter survival. Families would eat their largest, heaviest meal in the evening when they needed the most internal heat to get through the cold. Night breakfast was often light and warming, designed to jumpstart the body's heating system for the day. Midday meals provided energy for work, but weren't so heavy that they made afternoon labour difficult. Cooking techniques were adapted to maximise both warmth and fuel efficiency. Slow cooking methods that allowed food to simmer for hours over low fires made the most of limited fuel while extracting maximum nutrition from ingredients. These techniques also kept the house warm and filled it with warming, comforting aromas that provided psychological benefits as well as physical ones. Families developed sophisticated knowledge about food combining, understanding which combinations of ingredients would provide the most warming effects, the most sustained energy, and the best overall nutrition. This knowledge was passed down through generations and was constantly refined based on experience and necessity. Special foods were reserved for the coldest days or for family members who were struggling with the cold. Pregnant women, elderly family members, and children often received extra portions of warming foods or special preparations that were believed to provide extra heating benefits. This wasn't just kindness, it was survival strategy, because losing vulnerable family members meant losing the family's future. By the time spring arrived, families had often exhausted their stores of warming spices and special winter foods, but they had successfully maintained their health and energy through months of challenging conditions. The knowledge they had gained about warming foods and winter nutrition would serve them well in preparing for the next winter's challenges. Traditional Chinese medicine wasn't just about treating illness, it was about maintaining health and warmth during the brutal winter months, when staying healthy meant staying alive. Chinese peasants had developed sophisticated knowledge about herbs, treatments, and practices that could help the body generate heat, fight off cold-related illnesses, and maintain strength during the most challenging time of year. Understanding qi, the body's vital energy, was fundamental to winter survival medicine. Peasants learned to recognize when their qi was weakened by cold, and they knew techniques for strengthening and warming qi through diet, movement, and herbal treatments. This wasn't abstract philosophy, it was practical survival knowledge that could mean the difference between maintaining health and succumbing to winter's dangers. Herbal heating formulas were passed down through generations, with different families maintaining their own collections of warming herbs and their own knowledge about how to combine them effectively. Astragalus root was prized for its ability to strengthen the body's defensive qi and help maintain energy. During cold months, cinnamon bark was used to warm the interior and improve circulation. Dried ginger was essential for warming the digestive system and helping the body process foods efficiently. Moxibustion, the practice of burning dried mugwort on or near specific acupuncture points, was used to warm the body and strengthen qi during winter months. This treatment could be performed by family members and didn't require expensive equipment or professional practitioners. Families would grow and dry their own mugwort, creating stockpiles of this warming medicine for winter use. Breathing techniques were taught to children as basic survival skills. Proper breathing could help generate internal heat, improve circulation, and maintain energy during cold exposure. These techniques were simple enough to be practiced by anyone, but effective enough to provide real warming benefits when other heating sources weren't available. Massage and self-massage techniques helped maintain circulation during cold months when bodies were bundled in heavy clothing and movement was restricted. Families would massage each other's hands, feet and backs to keep blood flowing and prevent the stagnation that could lead to chilblains, frostbite and other cold-related injuries. Food as medicine became especially important during winter months. Certain foods were understood to have warming properties that went beyond simple caloric content. Foods were classified as warming, cooling, or neutral, and winter diets were carefully constructed to emphasize warming foods, while avoiding cooling foods that might reduce the body's internal heat. Preventive treatments were used to strengthen the body before winter arrived. Families would begin taking warming herbs and performing strengthening exercises in autumn, building up their body's reserves before the cold season demanded everything they had. This proactive approach often meant the difference between thriving and merely surviving through winter months. Treatment of common winter ailments relied heavily on warming therapies. For coughs and respiratory problems caused by cold exposure, families used warming herbs like fritillaria and platycodon combined with honey and warm liquids. For digestive problems caused by eating cold or difficult to digest foods, warming spices and herbs helped restore proper digestive function. External applications of warming medicines were used to treat localized cold exposure. Herbal poultices, warming oils, and heat-generating liniments helped treat areas of the body that had been exposed to cold and were showing signs of damage or reduced circulation. Sleep medicines weren't just about helping people fall asleep. They were about helping people sleep warmly and restoratively during long winter nights. Certain herbs were known to promote warming sleep that would leave people feeling more energetic and better able to generate heat the following day. Emergency treatments for severe cold exposure relied on rapidly warming the interior while gradually warming the exterior. Families knew techniques for treating hypothermia, frostbite, and other cold-related emergencies using whatever materials were available in their homes. Seasonal adjustments to medicine meant that treatments and preventive measures were modified based on the specific challenges of different winter months. Early winter treatments focused on strengthening and preparation. Midwinter treatments emphasized maintenance and support, and late winter treatments helped prepare the body for the transition to spring. Mental and emotional health during winter months was addressed through medicines and practices that helped maintain mood and motivation during the darkest, most challenging time of year. Certain herbs were known to lift spirits and provide energy, while community practices and rituals helped families support each other through the psychological challenges of winter survival. By spring, families had usually exhausted their stores of winter medicines, but they had successfully maintained their health through months of cold exposure, limited nutrition, and challenging living conditions. The medical knowledge they had developed and applied during winter months was an essential component of their survival strategy, as important as food storage, clothing, and shelter in keeping them alive until warm weather returned. Surviving winter was never a solitary endeavour for Chinese peasants. It required the coordinated efforts of entire villages, extended families, and social networks that had been developed over generations specifically to help people survive the months when individual families might not have enough resources to make it through on their own. Village grain stores were communal survival systems where families contributed portions of their harvest to collective stockpiles that could be drawn upon during emergencies. These weren't charity systems, they were insurance systems where everyone contributed what they could and everyone could receive help when they needed it. Families kept careful records of contributions and withdrawals, and these records were often maintained by the village's most respected elders. Shared labour systems meant that essential winter tasks were divided among community members based on ability and need. Younger, stronger men might be responsible for gathering fuel and maintaining fires for elderly neighbours. Women might take turns cooking for families where the primary cook was ill. Children might be organised into groups that helped with animal care or other essential tasks. Collective animal care ensured that valuable livestock survived through winter months when individual families might not have adequate shelter or feed for their animals. Villages would often construct shared animal shelters where community livestock could be housed together, sharing body heat and requiring less fuel to keep warm. Information sharing networks meant that weather predictions, successful survival techniques, and news about food availability were shared rapidly throughout the community. Villages developed their own communication systems, often using signal fires, drum patterns, or messenger networks to share crucial information about approaching weather, available resources, or families in distress. Communal workshops during the long winter evenings became essential survival activities. Families would gather in the largest available spaces to work on essential crafts, making and repairing clothing, creating tools, processing food, and maintaining equipment. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They conserved fuel by heating one large space instead of many small ones. They allowed for skill sharing and teaching, and they provided crucial social interaction during the isolated winter months. Childcare was often shared among families, especially when parents were ill or when certain adults needed to travel for essential supplies. Children were seen as community resources, and their survival was everyone's responsibility. Villages would organise children's activities that kept them warm, fed, and educated during months when normal outdoor activities were impossible. Elderly care systems ensured that the most vulnerable community members received the extra attention they needed to survive. Older villagers often possessed the most knowledge about traditional survival techniques, weather prediction, and resource management. So their survival wasn't just humanitarian, it was practical. Younger families would take turns checking on elderly neighbours, sharing fuel and food, and ensuring that no one was left alone during the most dangerous cold spells. Emergency response networks were activated when individual families faced crises that threatened their survival. If a family's fire went out, if their food stores were damaged, if their shelter was compromised, or if family members became seriously ill, the community would mobilise resources to help. These weren't acts of charity, they were investments in community survival, because individual family failures could quickly cascade into broader community problems. Skill specialisation meant that different families or individuals became known for specific expertise. One family might be the best at preserving food, another might excel at maintaining fires, someone else might be particularly skilled at weather prediction or herbal medicine. During winter months, these specialists would share their knowledge and skills with the broader community, ensuring that essential survival knowledge was distributed as widely as possible. Resource pooling systems allowed families to combine their individual resources into larger, more effective survival systems. Families might pool their fuel supplies, taking turns heating shared spaces. They might combine their food stores, creating more varied and nutritious communal meals. They might share tools, clothing, and other essential items, ensuring that everyone had access to what they needed for survival. Mutual surveillance systems, while they might sound ominous, were actually essential survival mechanisms. Community members kept watch over each other, noting when smoke wasn't rising from chimneys, when people weren't seen for several days, when sounds of distress might indicate problems. This wasn't nosiness, it was life-saving vigilance that ensured no one suffered or died alone. Dispute resolution became especially important during winter months, when tensions ran high, resources were scarce, and people were confined together in small spaces for extended periods. Villages developed mechanisms for resolving conflicts quickly and fairly, because unresolved disputes could destroy the cooperation that was essential for community survival. Seasonal festivals and celebrations weren't just entertainment, they were psychological survival tools that helped maintain community morale during the darkest, most challenging months. These events provided reasons to share food, create warmth through dancing and singing, and remind everyone that they were part of something larger than their individual struggles. Spring preparation was a community effort that began in late winter, with families coordinating their seed sharing, tool maintenance, and field preparation activities. Communities that worked together to prepare for spring planting were more likely to have successful harvests, which meant better preparation for the following winter's challenges. Marriage and kinship networks were strengthened during winter months as families had time to negotiate future alliances, arrange marriages, and solidify relationships that would provide mutual support in future years. Winter was often the season when extended family connections were renewed and community bonds were reinforced. Storytelling and knowledge transmission served crucial survival functions during long winter evenings. Older community members would share their knowledge about previous winters, successful survival techniques, and lessons learned from past challenges. This wasn't just entertainment, it was education that could save lives during future emergencies. Religious and spiritual practices provided communal comfort and meaning during the most challenging time of year. Shared prayers, rituals, and ceremonies helped maintain hope and provided psychological support that was essential for surviving months of hardship and uncertainty. By the time spring arrived, communities that had successfully cooperated through winter months emerged stronger, more connected, and better prepared for future challenges. The social bonds forged during winter survival became the foundation for year-round cooperation that improved everyone's chances of long-term survival and prosperity. Winter nights in rural China weren't just cold, they were profoundly dark in ways that modern people, accustomed to electric lights and illuminated cities, can barely imagine. When the sun disappeared behind the mountains, peasant families entered a world where light was precious, limited, and had to be carefully managed to last through the long hours until dawn. Oil lamps were the primary source of artificial light, but oil was expensive and had to be conserved carefully. Families would typically light just one small lamp per household, placing it centrally, where its feeble glow could be shared by everyone. The oil was often rendered animal fat, vegetable oil when available, or in desperate times, oil made from whatever organic materials could be processed. The light these lamps provided was dim, flickering, and cast dancing shadows that made the cold rooms feel even more mysterious and isolated. Candles were a luxury that most peasant families couldn't afford on a regular basis. When candles were available, they were reserved for special occasions or emergencies. Families learned to make their own candles from animal fat, beeswax when available, or even rushed wicks dipped in various oils. These homemade candles burned irregularly, dripped constantly, and provided very limited light, but they were better than nothing during the long winter darkness. Rushlights were a common alternative to more expensive lighting options. These were made by soaking dried reeds or rushes in animal fat, creating simple torches that could provide light for short periods. Rushlights burned quickly and had to be constantly tended, but they were cheap to make and could be prepared from materials that most families could gather themselves. Pine knots, pieces of resinous wood that would burn with bright, aromatic flames, were treasured when they could be found. These natural torches provided better light than most other options available to peasant families, but they also burned hot and fast, making them impractical for extended use. Pine knots were often saved for special occasions or for times when good light was absolutely essential. The management of light during winter evenings required careful planning and coordination. Families would schedule their activities around their limited light sources, doing detailed work like mending or crafting during the hours when light was available, and saving simpler tasks like storytelling or quiet conversation for the darker hours. Reflective surfaces were used to maximize the effectiveness of limited light sources. Families would position metal objects, polished stones, or even containers of water near their lamps to reflect and amplify the available light. These simple techniques could nearly double the effective illumination in a room, making precious oil or candles go further. Eye strain was a constant problem during winter months when people were forced to do detailed work by inadequate light. Families learned to recognize the signs of eye fatigue and would adjust their activities accordingly, alternating between tasks that required good vision and those that could be done by feel or in dim light. Early bedtimes weren't just about conserving light, they were about surviving winter. Going to sleep shortly after dark meant that families could extinguish their lights and conserve fuel while still getting adequate rest. Sleeping longer hours also meant burning fewer calories during the cold night hours, helping to conserve energy and food supplies. Communal lighting systems developed in some villages, where families would take turns providing light for shared evening activities. One family might supply oil for a communal lamp that would light a gathering space where multiple families could work, socialize, or share stories together. This system allowed for better light and fuel efficiency while providing essential social interaction during the isolated winter months. Firelight from the hearth provided some illumination, but it was inconsistent and often inadequate for detailed work. Families learned to position themselves around the fire in ways that maximized the available light while still staying warm. The flickering, dancing light from fires also created a constantly changing environment that was both comforting and challenging. Seasonal light depression was a real problem that families had to address. The combination of short daylight hours, dim indoor lighting, and constant overcast skies during winter months could lead to serious mood problems that affected everyone's ability to function effectively. Families developed strategies for maximizing exposure to whatever natural light was available, often rearranging their daily schedules to take advantage of the brightest hours. Navigation in the dark became an essential skill during winter months when people might need to move around their homes, tend to animals, or handle emergencies in near total darkness. Families memorized the layouts of their spaces, counted steps between important locations, and developed systems for moving safely without light. Emergency lighting systems had to be maintained for situations when immediate light was essential: medical emergencies, fires, or security threats. Families would keep emergency supplies of oil, candles, or other lighting materials in easily accessible locations, along with the means to quickly ignite them when needed. Dawn was celebrated not just because it marked the end of another surviving night, but because it brought the return of free, abundant, natural light. The first rays of sunshine streaming through windows were greeted with genuine relief and gratitude by families who had spent the long, dark hours carefully conserving their artificial light sources. By spring, when days were longer and natural light was abundant again, families had usually exhausted most of their winter lighting supplies, but they had successfully navigated months of darkness, maintaining their ability to work, socialize, and care for each other despite the challenging lighting conditions that made every evening task more difficult and more precious. The Chinese lunar calendar wasn't just a way of tracking time, it was a survival manual that helped peasant families predict weather patterns, plan agricultural activities, and prepare for the seasonal challenges that could mean the difference between life and death. Understanding the rhythms of the natural world was essential knowledge that was passed down through generations and constantly refined through careful observation and hard-won experience. Weather prediction, based on lunar cycles, seasonal patterns, and traditional knowledge, helped families prepare for severe cold spells, storms, and other dangerous weather events. Experienced weather watchers could often predict changes days or even weeks in advance, giving communities time to gather extra fuel, secure their animals, and prepare their homes for challenging conditions. Seasonal festivals weren't just celebrations, they were carefully timed community preparation activities. The winter solstice celebration marked the turning point when days would begin to lengthen again, providing psychological support during the darkest time of year. Spring festival preparations involved community-wide stock-taking, resource sharing, and planning for the coming agricultural season. Astronomical observations were practical survival tools rather than abstract scientific interests. Families learned to read the positions of stars, the phases of the moon, and the movements of planets as indicators of seasonal changes, weather patterns, and optimal timing for various activities. This knowledge was essential for planning everything from food storage to travel to medical treatments. Agricultural timing based on traditional calendar knowledge helped families plan their winter food storage and spring planting activities. Knowing exactly when the last safe planting dates occurred, when the first frost was likely, and when spring weather would reliably return was crucial for survival planning and resource management. Medicinal timing followed traditional calendar patterns that indicated when certain herbs were most effective, when certain treatments should be administered, and when the body was most receptive to different types of healing. Winter medical care was often timed according to lunar cycles and seasonal energy patterns. Food preservation schedules were coordinated with seasonal and lunar timing to maximize the effectiveness of different preservation techniques. Certain times were considered optimal for making pickles, drying meat, or fermenting foods, and families would coordinate their food preparation activities with these traditional timing systems. Animal care routines were adjusted according to seasonal patterns and traditional calendar knowledge. Farmers knew when animals were most likely to become ill, when they needed extra feed and care, and when breeding activities should be timed to ensure that young animals were born during favourable seasons. Spiritual and religious observances provided structure and meaning during the long, challenging winter months. Traditional festival dates marked important psychological milestones that helped families measure their progress through winter and maintain hope for spring's return. Community coordination relied heavily on shared calendar knowledge that ensured that everyone was prepared for seasonal challenges at the same time. Villages would coordinate their fuel gathering, food storage, and other winter preparation activities based on traditional timing that had been refined over generations. Work scheduling during winter months followed traditional patterns that balanced the need to accomplish essential tasks with the limitations imposed by cold weather, short daylight hours, and limited resources. Families knew which types of work were appropriate for different times of the winter season and planned their activities accordingly. Travel timing was crucial during winter months, when dangerous weather could trap travellers or make journeys impossible. Traditional calendar knowledge helped people plan safe travel windows, avoid the most dangerous weather periods, and coordinate with others who might be making similar journeys. Recovery timing helped families plan their emergence from winter into spring activities. Traditional knowledge indicated when it was safe to begin spring preparations, when stored foods could be supplemented with fresh resources, and when normal activities could resume after months of winter survival mode. Psychological support provided by traditional calendar observances helped families maintain hope and perspective during the most challenging months. Knowing that certain difficult periods were temporary and that traditional celebrations marked progress towards spring helped maintain the mental resilience that was essential for survival. Resource management was coordinated with traditional calendar knowledge that indicated when supplies should be conserved most carefully, when emergency reserves might be needed, and when families could begin to prepare for the transition to spring abundance. By the time spring arrived, families had successfully navigated another winter using traditional calendar knowledge that connected them to centuries of accumulated wisdom about seasonal survival. This knowledge wasn't just cultural heritage, it was practical survival information that had been tested and refined by countless generations of ancestors who had faced similar challenges. Winter clothing for Chinese peasants wasn't just about staying warm, it was about creating a personal survival system that could function effectively in temperatures that could drop well below freezing. Every garment, every layer, every technique was developed through generations of trial and error, refined by families whose lives depended on getting the details right. Silk undergarments, when families could afford them, provided an excellent base layer that was lightweight, warm, and naturally moisture-wicking. Silk was particularly valued because it could provide significant warmth without bulk, allowing for more layers on top. Families who had access to silk often saved it specifically for winter undergarments, understanding that this was an investment in survival rather than luxury. Cotton padding was used to create insulating layers in winter garments. Cotton batting was sewn between layers of fabric to create quilted garments that trapped air and provided excellent insulation. The quality of cotton padding could vary significantly, with families using everything from high-grade cotton to cotton waste, and even paper when better materials weren't available. Hemp clothing was common among peasant families because hemp was relatively easy to grow and process, and hemp fabric was durable and reasonably warm. Hemp garments were often rough and uncomfortable, but they could last for many years and provided adequate protection against cold weather when properly layered with other garments. Fur and leather garments were prized when available, but were often beyond the means of most peasant families. When families did have access to animal skins, every piece was used. Rabbit fur for trim and small accessories, sheepskin for vests and linings, and any available leather for outer garments that could repel wind and moisture. Footwear construction was particularly challenging because feet were vulnerable to frostbite, and because good footwear was essential for mobility during winter months. Peasant families developed sophisticated techniques for creating warm, dry footwear using layers of cloth, animal hair for insulation, and whatever waterproofing materials were available. Hand and head protection required special attention because extremities were most vulnerable to cold-related injury. Families would create mittens, gloves, hats, and scarves using whatever materials were available, often combining multiple materials to create the most effective protection possible. Garment maintenance during winter months was crucial because damaged clothing could be fatal. Families spent countless hours during winter evenings mending, reinforcing, and improving their clothing. Small tears had to be repaired immediately, worn areas had to be reinforced, and insulation had to be redistributed to maintain effectiveness. Drying techniques for wet clothing were essential skills because moisture in clothing could quickly lead to hypothermia. Families developed methods for drying clothes near fires without scorching them, for rotating wet garments to ensure even drying, and for preventing clothes from freezing solid before they could be dried. Seasonal clothing storage required families to carefully preserve their winter garments during warm months and prepare them for use when cold weather returned. This involved cleaning, mending, treating for insect damage, and storing in ways that would prevent deterioration during the months when winter clothes weren't needed. Clothing sharing within families and communities was common because good winter clothing was expensive and time-consuming to create. Families would pass down garments through generations, alter clothing to fit different family members, and sometimes share specialized items like heavy outer garments that weren't needed by everyone simultaneously. Improvised clothing solutions were necessary when families couldn't afford or create adequate winter garments. This might involve using blankets as cloaks, wrapping feet in rags instead of shoes, or creating temporary garments from whatever materials were available. These improvised solutions weren't ideal, but they could provide life-saving protection during emergencies. Clothing and status considerations meant that even during survival situations, families tried to maintain some level of dignity and appropriate appearance. Winter clothing might be patched, worn, and improvised, but families would still make efforts to keep their garments clean and respectable looking, understanding that social standing could affect their access to community support. Specialized work clothing was necessary for families who had to continue working outdoors during winter months. Farmers, traders, and others who couldn't remain indoors needed garments that would allow them to work effectively, while still providing protection against cold weather. Gender and age differences in clothing reflected the different needs and vulnerabilities of various family members. Pregnant women, elderly family members, and young children often required specialized clothing considerations that addressed their particular susceptibilities to cold weather. Emergency clothing systems had to be maintained for situations when normal clothing was damaged, lost, or inadequate. Families would keep emergency supplies of extra clothing, improvised garments, and materials that could be quickly assembled into protective clothing during crises. By spring, winter clothing was often thoroughly worn, heavily patched, and in need of significant repair or replacement. But families that had successfully maintained their clothing through the winter months had protected themselves against one of the most serious threats to winter survival, and they could begin planning and preparing clothing for the next winter season. The transition from winter to spring wasn't a sudden change for Chinese peasant families. It was a gradual, careful process that required as much planning and skill as winter survival itself. Families who had successfully survived the winter months now faced the challenge of rebuilding their strength, replenishing their resources, and preparing for another cycle of seasonal challenges. Early spring weather was often unpredictable and dangerous, with sudden temperature swings, late snowstorms, and deceptive warm periods followed by bitter cold snaps. Families had to remain vigilant and prepared for winter conditions even as they began to hope for permanent warm weather. Food stores assessment was one of the first spring activities as families calculated what remained of their winter supplies and planned how to stretch these resources until fresh food became available. Many families faced the challenging late winter period when stored foods were nearly exhausted, but fresh foods weren't yet available. Health recovery was essential after months of challenging winter conditions. Families needed to rebuild their strength, treat any health problems that had developed during winter, and prepare their bodies for the physical demands of spring planting and summer labour. Seed preparation and planning required families to balance their remaining food stores against their need for planting seeds. Eating seed grain was sometimes necessary for survival, but it meant no crops the following growing season. These were agonizing decisions that could affect the family's survival for years to come. Tool maintenance and repair had to be completed before spring planting could begin. Tools that had been damaged during winter or that had been neglected during the survival-focused winter months needed to be repaired, sharpened, and prepared for the intensive use they would receive during planting season. Field preparation began as soon as weather permitted, with families working to clear debris, repair irrigation systems, and prepare soil for planting. This work was physically demanding after months of relative inactivity, and families had to pace themselves carefully to avoid injury or exhaustion. Animal care intensified during spring months, as livestock that had survived winter needed to regain strength and health before breeding season and summer work demands. Animals that had been weakened by winter conditions required special care and feeding to restore their usefulness. Social reconnection with neighbours and extended community members was important after months of relative isolation. Families would visit neighbours, assess who had survived the winter successfully, and begin planning community activities for the coming growing season. Debt settlement and resource sharing often occurred during spring months, as families determined what they owed to neighbours who had helped them during winter emergencies, and what help they might be able to provide to others who were struggling with the transition to spring. Spiritual and religious observances marked the successful completion of another winter survival cycle and sought divine blessing for the coming agricultural season. These ceremonies provided psychological support and community bonding that was essential for maintaining hope and motivation. Weather watching remained crucial during spring months as families tried to predict the optimal timing for planting, the likelihood of late frosts, and the patterns that would affect the coming growing season. Making mistakes in spring weather prediction could ruin an entire year's agricultural efforts. Resource allocation required families to balance multiple competing needs: food for survival until harvest, seeds for planting, materials for tool and equipment maintenance, and reserves for unexpected emergencies during the growing season. Learning and knowledge sharing intensified during spring months as families shared information about what had worked well during the previous winter, what techniques had failed, and what improvements might be made for future winter survival. Hope and planning for the future became possible again as families emerged from the immediate survival challenges of winter and could begin thinking about longer-term goals, improvements to their homes and equipment, and strategies for better preparation for the next winter season. By the time summer arrived, families had successfully completed another cycle of seasonal survival, but they were already beginning to think about and prepare for the next winter's challenges. The knowledge they had gained, the techniques they had refined, and the community bonds they had strengthened during the previous winter all became part of their preparation for the challenges that would inevitably return when the cold weather came again. As we draw near the end of tonight's journey through the resilient world of Chinese peasant survival, it's worth reflecting on the remarkable ingenuity, community spirit, and quiet heroism of these ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges. Their story isn't one of grand battles or magnificent palaces, but of the daily triumph of human persistence over the harsh realities of survival in a world without modern conveniences. These peasant families, generation after generation, developed sophisticated systems for surviving conditions that would challenge even modern people with all our technology and resources. They created heating systems from earth and fire, insulation from whatever materials they could gather, clothing systems that provided protection in sub-zero temperatures, and community networks that ensured no one faced winter's challenges alone. Their knowledge was practical, tested by life and death consequences, and refined through centuries of experience. They understood nutrition, medicine, weather prediction, construction, and social organisation in ways that were perfectly adapted to their environment and circumstances. Every technique they used had been proven effective, not just once but through countless winters, faced by countless families who had learned that survival meant mastering every detail of their relationship with the natural world. Perhaps most remarkably, they maintained hope, community, and human dignity even under the most challenging circumstances. Their festivals, their stories, their care for elderly and young family members, their willingness to share resources with neighbours, all demonstrate that survival was about more than just staying alive. It was about maintaining their humanity and their connections to each other, even when the world seemed determined to break those bonds. The lessons they learned about cooperation, resource management, preparation, and resilience remain relevant today. In our modern world of climate control and global supply chains, we sometimes forget how completely our ancestors depended on their own knowledge, their community relationships, and their ability to adapt to challenging circumstances. Their legacy lives on, not just in the historical record, but in the descendants who carry their genes and their cultural knowledge in the techniques and traditions that are still practiced in rural communities around the world, and in the quiet reminder that human beings are capable of surviving and thriving even under the most difficult circumstances. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your warm, comfortable bed, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the long chain of survival and adaptation that made your comfort possible. Countless generations of peasants, farmers, and ordinary people faced winter's challenges and found ways to survive, to raise children, to maintain hope, and to pass on their knowledge to the next generation. Their nights were cold, dark, and challenging, but they were also filled with the warmth of family bonds, the comfort of shared stories, the satisfaction of skills mastered and challenges overcome. They slept knowing they had done everything possible to protect their families and prepare for another day of life in a beautiful, harsh, demanding world. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air of their small homes, their bodies huddled together under shared blankets, their fires banked carefully to last through the night. But they slept with the deep satisfaction of people who had earned their rest through hard work, careful planning, and successful cooperation with the natural world and their human community. In the end, their story is our story, the continuing human adventure of learning to survive, to adapt, to care for each other, and to find meaning and beauty even in the most challenging circumstances. They passed through their winters one night at a time, one breath at a time, one carefully tended fire at a time. And in doing so, they passed on to us the gift of their survival, their knowledge, and their quiet, enduring strength. So tonight, as winter winds blow outside your windows, as you settle into warmth and comfort they could hardly have imagined, rest well knowing that you carry within you the legacy of all those who came before, who faced the cold with courage, who shared their warmth with others, and who proved, night after night, year after year, that human resilience and community can overcome even winter's harshest challenges. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be as peaceful as the spring mornings that eventually came to every village, every family, every survivor who made it through winter's test and earned the right to see another season of growth, hope, and renewal.